Alright, we are here for our fifth and final match of our latest Brain Control League. We're on the draw, and we see Snap Path Snare. In some matchups, this is going to be quite terrible. In others, it's going to be at least reasonable. I think we can probably keep this going in blind. And we're playing against Affinity, so not the worst keep I've ever seen. That's definitely true. We're not going to play Colonnade here because Snare is probably a good card. Our opponent plays Steel Overseer, so I decided to let this resolve because we have two copies of Path in hand, and the card we really need to play around is obviously Etch Champion for one, and because of Etch Champion, Cranial Plating. So we're going to save our Snare for that. We're going to take one here. Just get a Watery Grave. Move on with our lives. At this point, okay, so we draw Bet Call, so now if we get an Enabler, we have a way to claw our way back into this game. Not that we're really buying that much at this point, but even so. We're going to play this untapped, so we can go ahead and Path the Overseer before he activates it. And we don't want our opponent to have Etch Champion. So opponent plays Ravager. We could not counter this Ravager and hold up Snare for Cranial Plating, but I decide if our opponent's doing this, he probably doesn't have Etch Champion, so I'm going to counter the Ravager. Opponent plays another Ravager. So now we're left with a decision. We have to deal with this Ravager and the crap it's going to produce. One way we can do that is that our opponent currently has two blockers on the ground, which is not always the case for Affinity. We kind of want to be building up toward hard casting Call here because hopefully that's what's gonna lock this game down for us if we can dodge Etch Champion, which our opponent may not have right now. So I think that we can play Snapcaster after our opponent attacks, target Path to Exile, not use Path to Exile and block Ravager, see what our opponent does. We're going to force him to a decision here. If our opponent Galv Blasts the Snapcaster Mage, that makes this a little tricky, but I think we can still just take the hit at that point, Path the Ravager, and then next turn Path whatever he puts the Ravager counters on. Hopefully he overextends. So here we're blocking. We have Path targeted. Our opponent does nothing. That's interesting. Puts the counters on the Memnite, which is also interesting because if we have another Snapcaster Mage, we are going to be able to trade profitably with that. However, he also knows that taking out Vault Scourge is probably better for us overall, so he wants to put the counters on the lower priority target. At this point, our opponent plays Steel Overseer, and we can't really, and then Vault Scourge. So our opponent's Hellbent and doesn't have a particularly strong board, but we have to use this Path on the Overseer. I mean, we could have used it on something else too. Probably the Memnite is our second target here because we don't really worry about our opponents gaining life at the moment. Here's Blessed Alliance, which is kind of cool. That might come in handy later. I decide we're probably not going to use that right now. And our opponent draws Cranial Plating. So our opponent cannot move that at instant speed right now. Decides to put it on a Vault Scourge to try to gain some life. So next turn, our opponent's going to be able to move this at instant speed. We're also out of spot removal. If we do draw, say like push though, then we can even escalate Blessed Alliance and push on the same turn. It's going to be great. So now we're left with a decision. Our opponent doesn't have, I mean obviously we're just going to play this landed pass. Our opponent doesn't have a lot of artifacts on the board. So we're not really standing to take a tremendous amount of damage from the Vault Scourge that we assume he's going to put the plating on. We could Cryptic now, tap his team. If he plays Etch Champion after combat, then we basically lose probably. Well, I guess it's roughly the same business because we can gain 4 and make him sack 1. What I decided is I would rather take a hit from the Vault Scourge, keep the Cryptic, which might eventually bounce this Cranial Plating, and I'm just going to gain 4 and make him sack the Memnite. Or I guess he could theoretically move the plating and sack the Vault Scourge to get an extra point of damage. As it stands, he does sack the Memnite, so we're only taking 5 here. I'm not sure, well, I guess, I'm not sure the flying matters. Maybe he wants us to I mean, he could have a Galv Blast in hand, for example. Maybe he wants to trade the Vault Scourge for a Colonnade. I mean, he could easily trade a Memnite for a Colonnade. Probably gaining life is just better than the extra point of damage. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, actually, in this matchup. But now our opponent plays Etch Champion. So, that's not great. However, we can tap our opponent's team, buy an extra turn. Hard casting call, not looking so great. If we draw Sram's Expertise, we basically win here, though, because the Sram's tokens can block Etch Champion. Here's a push, which is interesting. Opponent plays a Nexus. So now we probably want to tap our opponent's team so we don't die. We could also theoretically push this Vault Scourge right now. Hoping, just like reducing our opponent's artifact count by 1 also. Make the Etch Champion a little weaker. So it's going to be a 6-7, I guess, next turn if he doesn't draw an artifact. Now we have a decision. So we can push an artifact that he plays and Ghost Quarter the Inkmoth Nexus. Hoping to, and Esper Charm to draw 2, and that will let us live a turn if he doesn't draw exactly Galv Blast. That seems kind of reasonable. I actually don't remember what I did here. So opponent equips. Alright, so it's a 6-2, 7-2. If our opponent plays another artifact, 7-2 once he activates Nexus, plays another artifact that's lethal, Ghost Quarter the Nexus, push whatever else he plays. Hopefully it's not like a drum. Actually, I mean, that would be fine, I guess. Hopefully it's not a Galv Blast. And then we Esper Charm to draw 2 and hope to hit Sram's or Supreme Verdict or Cryptic to buy us a turn. Incidentally, it's worth noting we only have one Blessed Alliance main deck, and our Snapcaster Mage, our only Snapcaster Mage, is already dead. So that is a problem with trading the Snap like we did earlier. Opponent plays a Vault Scourge and swings in. Gonna activate Inkmoth. I'm gonna quarter the Nexus. Opponent swings. Doesn't swing. Oh, okay. So he was quartering the Nexus. He's playing around the second copy of Blessed Alliance. That's right. That's what happened here. So that was pretty huge for us. Now we still don't stand to get lethal next turn given this Fatal Push in hand, and we draw a Verdict. That's what happened. This was great. So I think our opponent maybe played a little too conservatively there, running around Blessed Alliance. At the same time, Etch Champion is such a beating that, you know, that's one thing, and he doesn't know we're about to draw like 3 cards to find some kind of answer to it. So I can see him protecting that. Obviously, in retrospect, it doesn't look like a great decision, but at the same time. So we draw Negate, which doesn't really do anything. We're still at 8 life, so we're not even super worried about Galv Blast. And we're going to be up against the decision to either trade with the Nexus via Colonnade, push the Nexus, or we can hardcast Call here. I decided not to hardcast Call here, and I think that's a mistake. Should not have done that, I believe. Hardcasting Call would have been kind of a blowout, I think. Opponent plays Vault Scourge, fires up Nexus, attaches Cranial Plating, and now that our opponent has 2 threats, we're basically like priced into pushing the Nexus and then blah blah blah. So that's not particularly good. Here's a Serum Visions, but I think at the end of the day we need to just hardcast Call so we don't somehow die here. And this is good. Our opponent played another Nexus and didn't swing, didn't want to make this trade. Now we get to Serum Visions. We have a push. Path and Pier both seem reasonable. Spell Snare is a pretty good draw, and I decided to just swing with 2 here. There's no real reason not to. Our opponent's not going to block that probably. Even if he did, we would push it, but... Opponent draws a land. We get that Pier back. We're going to keep swinging. Opponent might be looking for a more high-profile trade with the Colonnade at some point. But at this point, our opponent's doing nothing is just hugely beneficial for us. So here's another bet call, which unfortunately we have to reveal to our opponent. And we draw Brain in a Jar. So we're just going to play that. And we're going to swing in for 2. Opponent chooses not to block. So feeling pretty good with Spell Snare and Push in hand. Our opponent's getting to a life total where if we fuse Bet Call and draw Cryptic, we might be able to tap down an Etched Champion. We might also be able to bounce the Cranial Plating and snare it at some point. So here's an Etched Champion. We have no answer to it, which is unfortunate. So we're going to tick up Jar. We could consider pushing the Vault Scourge. I think that's a decent move because at this point we're kind of in a race situation, right? We need to draw something that's going to tap down or deal with this Etched Champion or plating, and we don't want our opponent to gain 8 life here if he activates the Nexus. So we're going to swing. Another Colonnade doesn't really do anything. We're just going to go ahead and fuse Bet Call in case it influences our decision in one way or another. And we draw a Cryptic, so we draw a double Cryptic. So this is excellent for us. Another advantage of running 3 Cryptics in the deck. So I think if we just tap down our opponent's team here, we probably win. We're going to want to swing for 4. If we just tap down our opponent's team twice in a row, we probably win. That being said, we could also think about bouncing this Cranial Plating. And then the race is like pretty favorable for us. So opponent decides to go all in. I guess he wants to make us block the Nexus since we're in a racing situation. He's still playing around Blessed Alliance also. Makes sense, makes sense. At this point, we're going to tap his team since he activated this Nexus already. That's pretty good for us, although he wouldn't have attacked with it. Like, tapping Etched Champion and then afterwards he activates Nexus and attacks into a 1/1 token is a terrible situation. So we bounce this. He replays it, probably. We're going to snare the shit out of that. I don't think our opponent can really win here. Plays Steel Overseer. We draw Bet Call. So we're 1 point short of lethal. And kind of wishing I had attacked with an extra token earlier when we had that push in hand. Because we would have still lived given the board state. So that's something to remember. I should have been a little more aggressive there. Instead of leaving back 2, that doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, it would have enticed him into attacking, which would have been good for us. So at this point, we do want to just swing for 8. And then basically if we tap our opponent's team down, we win anyway. So it doesn't really matter. We're just going to do it. I just do it on draw step to save time. And then we can more or less F6 here. I mean, not really F6 in case there's something we want to not. But there isn't. There's just nothing he can draw to get him out of this. So that's good. On to game 2. What's going on? Slip is here, back with our second game of the 5th and final match of this Brain Control League. We're on the draw, and we see this hand. So if we draw into Hallowed Fountain or like Fetch equivalent or Colonnade maybe even, this hand is basically the nuts against Affinity, right? So we have a little bit of spot removal, we have a Ruined Halo for Etched Champion, and we have fusing Bet Call, which is more or less game over. And we only have 1 land, and it's a Godless Shrine, which means we can't cast a Serum Visions if we draw it. So I decide I'm going to keep this on the draw. I'm going to give it a shot. If this pans out, it's going to be a really good hand. Like, the payoff is really high. Probably wouldn't keep this in a really serious context. Our opponent did mulligan first, so I was like, oh, you know, opponent might not have a great hand either. Our opponent probably doesn't have the best hand because didn't have a 2-drop to play here. Knows we have Spell Snare, would have played the 2-drop immediately. So there's a Peer Through Depths. That doesn't do a ton. I decide I'm going to play this Godless Shrine untapped just to be able to use our mana efficiently in case we actually don't draw something. This is another thing that makes this hand like almost acceptable, right, is that we have 2 turns of path and push until we get to that land and we can play Jar. I'm going to play Signal Pest. Must have just drawn that. Doesn't play a 3rd land, so we're probably looking at an Etched Champion hand and no 2-drops and just played a Signal Pest, so this Ruined Halo is probably going to be good. We are going to push this Pest. And our opponent plays Galv Blast, so that makes a lot of sense. This is another thing they wouldn't have been playing. Now they have 3 artifacts. And we draw Brain in a Jar. Wonderful, wonderful card. My favorite. Nothing we can do here. Hope our opponent doesn't draw a land. Opponent draws a land. Opponent plays Overseer, so not so bad. Didn't play a 3-drop. Our opponent still hasn't done anything, and it's his 3rd turn, so that's pretty good for us. Unfortunately, we do have to give our opponent a land here. And we draw Serum Visions, just to rub it in as Serum Visions we can't cast, that if this were a blue source, would certainly dig us out of this situation, but if it were a blue source, we also couldn't have run Push and Path both. So opponent starts unloading stuff, plays an Arcbound Ravager. Hand is not so bad so far, but we are pretty mana screwed. We're at 14 already, and we really need to draw land here. If we draw land here, I think we still probably win, but we draw Ruined Halo. So that's bad. Now we're getting to a point where we just probably can't dig our way out of this, because there's like nothing we can really Ruined Halo, right? And one more kind of aggressive turn by our opponent, especially with this Nexus, like if we Ruined Halo this and he goes all in on the Ravager, we're going to be dead pretty quickly. Brain in a Jar is not really going to do anything for very long. Opponent pumps this with Blink Moth. We're at 3 poison. So opponent's getting toward representing lethal with the Ink Moth Nexus. And we draw a Colonnade. So if this were an untapped land, what could we do? We could Ruined Halo the Ink Moth. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That seems good. He pumps this. I think that's more than lethal with the Ink Moth. Unfortunately, we just have to play it tapped and represent removal, which is bad. So opponent, we're hoping, kind of gets in there. Does draw an extra counter effectively. Opponent could go all in here, but we are representing some kind of removal spell. He saw a lot of removal spells game 1, and he's in such control of this. I don't think he really needs to do anything much. So we go to 9. If we draw a land, nope, we draw a bet call. So we know this Ink Moth is lethal. He's pretty likely to go. I mean, if we tap out for Brain in a Jar, he's just definitely gonna go for it. This, on the other hand, is almost lethal. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's not quite lethal now. So if we Ruined Halo, like Arcbound Nexus, then we get 1 turn to find a way to like get rid of the actual damage producing stuff. But if he draws an artifact, we're dead. So I'm going to Ruined Halo the Nexus. There's more or less nothing we can do here, though. And our opponent goes all in. And we die. We die a lot. So that worked. That worked well. And my math was also off on that, I suppose. What? Opponent played Vault Scourge, and we had Exacties. Yeah, okay. So no, my math was not off. He just drew an artifact and played the Vault Scourge, right? So that works. That works. On to game 3. All right. I didn't mention sideboarding in game 2. Sideboarding in this, we don't really want our negate. I don't really like Logic Knot either, although I don't like Cryptic much. Honestly, I don't think we need to be on the super counter plan. But I left in 2 Cryptics because it's generally like a utility card. We have enough removal to get there. We want the other Verdict. I brought in the Explosives. It's okay here. It can be good. Sometimes their CMCs are really spread out, but that's okay. And we want the Blessed Alliance and the Ruined Halos because of Etched Champion, because of life gain, blah, blah, blah. Cool. So we're on the play this time, and we see this hand. This is a Snap Keep. I mean, Affinity can like get some hands that race really well. I think we want to probably prioritize getting some kind of removal spell here. So there's a Spell Snare and a Fatal Push. I think we want both of those. I mean, obviously we already have the Spell Snare, so we draw the Push. Here's a Drum. And Scourge. Okay, so now I think we want a Serum Visions. and hold up push. We don't want to jar here and tap out. There's no reason to let our opponent resolve a cranial plating if we can help it. If our opponent plays a Ravager, it's better to get rid of it on the stack. If our opponent plays an Overseer, we can let it resolve, I suppose. Or we can just, yeah, we'll let it resolve and push it is what we'll do probably. Blessed Alliance and Spell Snare, these cards are both pretty good. Pretty good. Did I top both of those? Top, that's what I thought. That's what I would have done. Opponent plays Cranial Plating right into a Spell Snare. I mean, we shocked there, but I guess we were also representing push. Opponent plays another Vault Scourge. Alright. At this point, we stacked it so that Spell Snare was on top. And we have the option to keep Blessed Alliance if our opponent plays exactly Etch Champion here. It doesn't really do anything, honestly. If our opponent plays Etch Champion, we have like one piece of removal too little. So we're probably going to want to bet call here. But Spell Snare being a 1-mana play that we can actually play this turn with Jar, I figured I'd leave the Blessed Alliance on top. And if we really want it, we can fetch it, keep it. But otherwise, we're going to fetch it away. Opponent taps things and does play Etch Champion. So at this point, Blessed Alliance isn't really going to do what we want it to do, I think. And we just get a Plains here. We need to be able to cast Verdict. We're going to go ahead and push a Vault Scourge. Opponent's Hellbent. And here's a Verdict, so this is great. This is absolutely great. Our opponent's not going to be able to resolve a plating for this champ. We're going to be in good shape. I decide, don't want to miss a land drop here. And we get a bunch of lands, including 2 Ghost Quarters, which is pretty solid. So we can Verdict soon, which is good. Opponent plays Plating. We snare that. Definitely glad we put that on top earlier. Opponent attacks for not 2. 2. Good. Now, with our opponent attacking for 2 a turn, I think we want to try to fade a 3rd Cranial Plating here and just tick Jar up and see what kind of mileage we can get out of Instant Speed Supreme Verdict. I just attack for 1, because why not? Why not? You can block it with your Ornithopter, but maybe it's a trick. I don't know. Opponent activates a Nexus. That's interesting. And attacks with a bunch of stuff. So trading with the Nexus seems pretty free. We could think about trading for a bunch of these things and just to preserve our life total, and then not trading with the Nexus because he seems to want to like threaten the Infect line. I actually kind of like doing this and then swinging for 1 point next turn and then verdicting. I think that's totally fine. I do want to keep our life total up a little bit, and the thing is if we take 4 here, we're in Galv Blast range, right? So double Galv Blast range, whereas if we take 2, we're still at 9. And 9 is a better life total. Opponent pumps the Ink Moth, pretty much irrelevant. So we're going to Verdict and then have 2 Ghost Quarters for these 2 lands and then 2 removal spells in hand. So we take this up. Kind of hoping we draw something reasonable here. Peer Through Depths is very reasonable. So we get in for 1, counting the block. Opponent does not activate. Does he swing with the Ornithopter? Yes, he does, playing around Blessed Alliance. So we don't get a real value play out of this, but we do want to go ahead and kill this before we go into double Galv Blast range. Then we just don't have as many things to worry about. And these lands aren't going to do a ton to us anyway. Instant Speed Supreme Verdict is good. It's a good card. Peer, and we see a lot of stuff. So we can get Cryptic, we can get Esper Charm. These are both good cards. They're both good cards. I think Supreme Verdict is the best kind of panic button situation here. We can just leave our Jar on 3 and just sit on the Verdict for a while until we get something that helps us stabilize a little more. That seems like a good call to me. I'm just going to take that. So we're planning on taking our Jar down to 3 next turn, and we draw another Jar. So we're going to go ahead and play that. Opponent activates. Plays Thoughtseize. That's interesting. Opponent's going to have a rough time with this decision. And the issue with taking Verdict there is, like, yes, because we can play it at instant speed, you probably want to take Verdict, because that's kind of a fucker, like, I mean, a fuck up, like, it just messes up everything, right? But, the benefit for us is that we can take this jar all the way down to 0 and take this one up, and then we're probably going to hit something pretty good. Okay, so Blessed Alliance, Ruined Halo, Srom's Expertise. These all seem like pretty good cards to me, except for the Flooded Strand. So I think we want to take all 3 of the spells here, honestly. So Ruined Halo is an answer to S Champion. Blessed Alliance is an answer to both the next threat our opponent plays, or the 3rd threat from now that's not S Champion, and Galv Blast, because it lets us gain life. And Srom's Expertise is just a way to actually close out the game while we just kind of one by one run through our opponent's garbage. So probably want Srom's on top, I think. I believe the order I went with was Srom's, then Ruined Halo, then Blessed Alliance, because if our opponent plays Edge Champion next turn, like the earliest we want Ruined Halo is next turn, but if we want it next turn, it could be important. We're definitely, unless our opponent plays Edge Champion, we're definitely not going to need Blessed Alliance next turn, so we're just going to tap out for this. We'll leave up 1 Ghost Quarter. If our opponent wants to attack with the Inkmoth Nexus, we'll just take a hit from it. That is fine. So now our opponent has 3 threats. No reason not to take these up. When we draw a Ruined Halo, we're just going to go ahead and swing for 3 here. I'm not Ruined Haloing yet just because S Champion doesn't have haste. Might as well, like if our opponent draws a Wear Tear or something and unloads on a jar while we take it around, that's fine. Opponent plays these things. I go ahead and burn one of our removal spells. Maybe that's a little loose. But we're about to draw Blessed Alliance. I also probably shouldn't have done that before combat, but I guess it doesn't matter. You could have still done all this stuff. I'm going to quarter this. And then I'm going to take that one up and not take the other one up. So now we have Blessed Alliance for 3 mana, like fully escalated. Still swinging for 3. Opponent plays Mox Opal. I probably shouldn't have Fatal Pushed that Inkmoth, though. I think that was a mistake. And I'm just going to go ahead and Blessed Alliance this to gain life now. We could have used the Ghost Quarter. Maybe that's better. Maybe that's better. I don't think it really matters at this point. We take this jar up to 4. We're going to have a lot of scrying to do next turn. It's going to be awesome. We draw Beck Call. Opponent plays Ash Champion. That's not going to do anything. And here, Brain Jar, Explosives, Cryptic Path. I don't know if we really want explosives at this point. Yeah, it doesn't seem very good to me. Let's just bottom that. And probably we can deal with like Cryptic or something. Maybe Path, but... So we scry again just to get this to 1 since we put this all the way down to 4. So not the most efficient use of our scry, but I think it would have ended up with the same keeps anyway. And now we're going to Ruined Halo, Etch Champion. We're going to attack for 3. And our opponent scoops. I guess we just topped like 4 cards. So I mean, not 4 cards, but, you know, we just scried 4 and went bottom, bottom, top, top. And ticked a jar down to 1 after we did that. So, and then Ruined Halo'd his best card. Like, I can understand scooping there. But anyway... So that was a good game. This is generally kind of how it goes against Affinity. Like sometimes an Etch Champion does a number on us, but usually we're able to stabilize pretty well, and the Srom's Beck lines really line up well against what they want to do. So that's good, and we went 5-0 in this league. Kind of janky a little bit, the decks that we faced, but we are a little janky ourselves, so that's okay. Pretty happy with this list, too. I like the Serum Visions. With 1 Peer version, and I even like the 3 Cryptics. The last 2 leagues I've done, I didn't record the last one. I recorded the one before it, which did not have 3 Cryptics. The last one I did was this same list, and I went 4-1, losing to Shock Troopa in the last match. to not get the 5-0. But I got played. That guy outplayed me really hard. It was sexy. So this is pretty good, though. I'm liking this list. I think I'm going to take this exact same 75 for a spin next time as well. We'll see how it goes. I'm currently 13-2 over my last 3 leagues. So that's a pretty good streak. We'll see how those percentages continue, and I will see you next time. Cheers.